So my name is Dr. Darragh McCashin. I'm chair of the Observatory project here at the Anti-Bullying Centre in Dublin City University. I'm also assistant professor in the School of Psychology. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Fiona O'Rourke and Dr. Catherine Baker, co-authors on this report. Before I hand over to lead author, Dr. Fiona O'Rourke, I'm just going to give a little bit of context. But before we begin, just to let you know, we will be adhering to the Royal Society Community Moderation Guidelines, and we'll post that in the chat just to ensure that all comments are brief, polite and specific. And of course, any trolling or abusive behaviours will see participants removed. So we might go to our second slide there, please. So just a brief overview of our plan today. It's going to be tight with the 1 hour, but we will do our best. I'm going to hand over to give my colleagues Fiona and Catherine a chance to give you a brief overview of what this resource is, how it's come about, and the specific content as well. We're also delighted to be joined by our peers, Jane McGarrigle, National Coordinator at Webwise, and Dr. Kenny Doyle, Project Officer at Men's Development Network, who'll be responding to the resource and giving their own kind of perspectives from their applied settings of working with young people. So we're especially excited to hear their points of view. And as you listen, you may have questions, which we have a function for on our webinar here as well. And Dr. Catherine Baker will be collating those questions, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end to walk through them. A bit about the project overall. This is funded by the Department of Justice, and the Observatory on Cyberbullying, Cyberhate and Online Harassment is trying to keep its finger on the pulse of all things online hate in Ireland. And one of the key issues, of course, in the past few years has been particularly the role of certain influencers on young boys. And that overall context will be picked up now by Fiona. So I'll hand over to Dr. Fiona O'Rourke. And thank you for listening. You're all very welcome.
Thanks, Darragh. So this is an outline of our presentation. We're going to begin by briefly speaking about online influencers and discuss who and what they are. We'll then focus on talking about online masculinity influencers like Andrew Tate and the impact they're having on children and young people and the need for evidence-based educational interventions to address them. We'll speak about how our educational resource was produced in response to these needs. We'll provide an overview of our resource, which is titled Addressing the Impact of Masculinity Influencers on Teenage Boys, a guide for schools, teachers, parents, and guardians. We'll conclude by highlighting the advice and support information we provide in the resource. Before we start, it's important to point out that this presentation and the educational resource it describes does make reference to discriminatory and hateful language, including sexual-based discrimination and sexual violence, which some may find distressing. So in recent years, there's been a significant rise in the number of children and young people in Ireland, the UK, and elsewhere engaging with online influencers. Online influencers are individual internet users who have developed a sizable community of followers on social media platforms, such as YouTube and TikTok, through content production and distribution, social interactions and personal appearances on these digitized spaces, which have the ability to influence others. Influencers can have a positive impact on their followers by providing them with entertainment and opportunities for learning and skill development, such as those who post positive motivational health and fitness videos on social media. However, in recent years, there's been increasing concerns about how young people, particularly teenage boys, are engaging with online masculinity influencers, such as Andrew Tate, who post content on social media platforms on issues relating to men and masculinity, some of which promotes harmful ideas and behaviours, including oppressive forms of masculinity that are predicated on sexual and gender-based abuse, harassment, and violence. The adverse impact of these influencers has been well documented in the media in recent years. This slide features some headlines which highlight how misogynistic ideas and behaviours promoted by influencers like Andrew Tate are driving misogyny and sexual harassment in schools in Ireland, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Studies indicate that there is a very high prevalence rate of online engagement with Andrew Tate among children and young people in Ireland and the UK. According to representative polling data, 54% of children aged 6 to 15 had heard of Andrew Tate. This includes 60% of boys within that age category. However, for boys aged 13 to 15, this increased to 84%. Studies have found a link between misogynistic attitudes and behaviours promoted by online masculinity influencers and violent supportive attitudes among children and young people. A 2023 report written by Women's Aid found that children and young people exposed to misogynistic social media content like Andrew Tate's were almost 5 times more likely to view hurting someone physically as acceptable if you say sorry afterwards. Studies have also indicated that some of the content posted by online masculinity influencers on social media can also pose profound risks to the boys and young men who consume it. A report by Internet Matters indicates that Tate's dangerous claims that real men don't cry, that mental illness makes people weak, and that depression isn't real can pose a significant threat to boys' mental health, well-being, and self-esteem. Other studies have found that homophobic and transphobic content reifies homophobia and transphobia among children and young people. I'll hand it over to Catherine.
Thank you, Fiona. This resource follows up from a piece of research also funded by the Observatory and conducted by myself, Professor Debbie Ging, and Dr. Maya Brandt Andreasen that came out earlier this year, which analysed the impact of recommender algorithms on social media platforms in promoting misogynistic and other types of harmful content to teenage boys. An important finding of this research were that teenage boys were algorithmically recommended this type of content when they searched out content such as video games, sports, and gym tips. Additionally, this content was comprised primarily of content made by masculinity influencers. And it's important to note that such content represents a highly curated and monetized model of content production aimed at superficially engaging with the concerns and insecurities of boys and young men, which then becomes a gateway for promoting their discriminatory content. And a copy of this report is available on the ABC website. The harmful impact of online masculinity influencers on children and young people presents serious safeguarding concerns for schools, teachers, and parents and guardians, which urgently needs to be addressed via appropriate educational interventions and initiatives. However, to date, there's a lack of research-informed educational resources that provide schools, teachers, and parents in Ireland and elsewhere with guidance on how to effectively address the impact of these influencers on children and young people, including teenage boys. Therefore, over the last year, we've aimed to address this research gap and create an educational resource aimed at addressing this issue. The research project took on 2 stages. Stage 1 was conducting an evidence and policy review on the impact of online masculinity influencers on boys and young men and strategies to address them. This was published in a research report authored by Dr. Darragh McCashin and is available on the ABC website. And stage 2, which we're presenting on today, was to develop a research-informed educational resource that provides guidance to schools, teachers, parents, and guardians on how to address the impact of masculinity influencers on teenage boys. As part of stage 2, we set up a research team, including research advisor and lead author, Dr. Fiona O'Rourke, principal investigator, Dr. Darragh McCashin, and myself. And in addition, we set up an expert research advisory group of academics and practitioners with whom we consulted during the research planning stage. This included Professor Debbie Ging, Dr. Kenny Doyle, Dr. Claire Edwards, Professor Jane Souter, Dr. Elaine Burns, Dr. Emily Setti, Dr. Craig Haslop, and Dr. Nigel Mulligan. The resource development comprised of 4 stages. First, conducting secondary research and identifying key issues for targeted intervention. 2, consulting with our expert advisory group of academics and practitioners. 3, drafting the resource, which was then reviewed by members of our advisory team. And finally, today, launching the resource via webinar to our stakeholders, including school staff, teachers, parents, and guardians. And I will now hand back over to Fiona to introduce the resource itself.
Thanks, Catherine. So our educational resource, which we're launching today, aims to provide schools, teachers, parents, and guardians with guidance on how to address the impact of online masculinity influencers on young people, particularly teenage boys aged 13 to 18, via educational interventions and initiatives. The resource is divided into 3 main parts, which you can see on the slide. Part 1 provides information about online masculinity influencers who promote harmful ideas and behaviours and the impact they're having on children and young people, which is based on secondary research. Part 2 identifies the implications this research has for understanding and responding to the impact these influencers are having on children and young people, particularly teenage boys, via educational interventions. Part 3 presents practical guidance to school staff, teachers, and educators on how to address the impact of online masculinity influencers, which may also be helpful for parents and guardians who are preparing to have such discussions with their children. The resource also has an appendices section, which includes a resource hub and information about relevant advice and support services school staff, parents, and guardians can access. Within the time limits of this presentation, we'll not be able to talk about all of the issues explored in these sections in great depth, but we will touch on some of them. So on the slide, you can see the various issues explored in part 1 of our resource, which includes the ideas and behaviours promoted by online masculinity influencers like Andrew Tate and others, including the disrespectful, discriminatory, and hateful language they use. We also consider other issues such as why such masculinity influencers are popular amongst some teenage boys and what strategies they use to engage them. Part 1 provides information about masculinity influencers like Andrew Tate and Myron Gaines, who promote harmful ideas and behaviours via social media content, and we explore the impact it is having on children and young people. You can see some sample pages from this section on the screen. In our resource, we indicate that there are a number of key issues that should be considered when developing educational interventions to address the impact of online masculinity influencers like Andrew Tate. Firstly, it's important to recognise that these influencers are symptoms of societal problems that include sexism, misogyny, and gender inequalities, which long precede digital technologies and social media. The harmful ideas and behaviours these influencers promote have emerged from an ecosystem of spaces in our society and culture that maintain and reproduce gendered power dynamics and inequalities. You can see from the image on the screen that this social and cultural ecosystem includes a range of social structures and institutions, including families, schools, media, and legal systems, which we can be implicated in. Those concerned with tackling these issues should critically examine these social and cultural ecosystems rather than just examining individual online masculinity influencers. Another point to be considered is that there is a need to understand and take very seriously the appeal of online masculinity influencers among some teenage boys and young men, and the way they're engaging them by acknowledging specific issues they're facing, which do not appear to be meaningfully addressed on a significant scale elsewhere. Some of these issues include boys and men feeling alienated from critical conversations about masculinity in a post-Me Too era, boys feeling confusion about what it means to be a man and not getting appropriate support and guidance in dealing with these issues. When working to address the impact of online masculinity influencers, therefore, it's important to first familiarise yourself with these issues, which are explored in our resource, so that you can better understand how to talk to boys about them. Schools, teachers, parents, and guardians can play a key role in reaching out to boys who may feel alienated within their peer groups and communities, and supporting them in dealing with the issues they're facing, which may deter them from seeking out and engaging with harmful ideas and behaviours associated with masculinity influencers. There's a need to invest in supportive offline environments and to create a more positive culture around masculinity and what it means to be a man, especially for teenage boys and young men, which should involve promoting positive male role models and a masculine identity they can aspire to. Ultimately, these initiatives should aim to support boys and men to build healthy, respectful, and equitable social and intimate interpersonal relationships. As we've already indicated, online masculinity influencers and the harmful ideas and behaviours they promote have emerged from a social and cultural ecosystem which has produced gender inequitable societies and cultures. Therefore, it's important not to attribute all of the harms associated with online masculinity influencers to digital technologies and social media. Instead, take a balanced approach and consider both the potential harms and positive benefits of digital technologies and social media. It's also extremely important to acknowledge that teenage boys and young men do have agency in relation to harmful ideas and behaviours associated with masculinity influencers. For instance, studies show that content promoted by these influencers will not appeal to all boys and young men. Some are very critical of these influencer cultures and the harmful ideas and behaviours they promote.
Within this resource, we lay out 4 guiding principles for carrying out interventions with teenage boys around these sensitive issues. The first is critical thinking and reflection, which gives boys critical thinking and reflection skills that enable them to recognize the harmful gendered ideas and behaviors promoted by online masculinity influencers, rather than simply telling them that they are bad. The second is knowledge and understanding, which focuses on developing boys' knowledge and understanding about both the potential harms and positive benefits of digital technology and social media in ways to aim to support them in navigating these spaces safely and responsibly. 3 is agency and social responsibility, which focuses on enabling boys to understand that harmful ideas and behaviors promoted by online masculinity influencers can adversely affect all gendered groups, so they feel a sense of collective responsibility to resist and challenge them. And 4th is the meaningful inclusion of boys, which focuses on considering meaningful ways of engaging boys in the design and development of educational interventions, focused on addressing online masculinity influencers in ways that aim to value and support their agency. In part 3 of the resource, we outline guidance for addressing the impact of masculinity influencers, and this includes information for teachers, tips for engaging teenage boys on these topics, key discussion themes, potential challenges, and information for schools. In our section on information for teachers, we provide practical guidance on how teachers can engage teenage boys in critical discussions about online masculinity influencers, which may be helpful for parents and guardians who are prepared to have such discussions with their child or children. Guidance includes information about how to facilitate discussions, youth-centered facilitation techniques, discussion frameworks, and discussion themes, including men, masculinity, and mental health, what it means to be a successful man, and men, women, and gendered roles.
Thanks, Catherine. So our resource also provides information about the skills required to facilitate critical discussions about masculinity. Such work is complex and it requires an appropriate mindset, professional skills, and the capacity for self-reflexive practices. Education professionals facilitating these critical discussions in schools should have the professional skills required to do so in a safe and considered way, which may involve talking about gender disinformation and conspiracy theories, gender-based disinformation, and sexual violence, dealing with personal disclosures, following safeguarding policies and procedures, and signposting to relevant support services. Our resource provides information about relevant training programs and advice and support services. Our resource also provides a number of practical tips for talking to boys about masculinity in ways that aim to be constructive and empathetic. Firstly, we recommend taking a positive, affirmative approach to these discussions, rather than one that is negative and combative. Secondly, we recommend giving careful consideration to the language used to talk about masculinity and to avoid using the term toxic masculinity, as boys can interpret it as equating men and masculinity to being toxic. We recommend creating a safe, open, and inclusive space for interactive discussion, which is non-judgmental and empathetic. Encourage self-reflection and positive aspirations. For instance, invite teenage boys to reflect on the kind of man they aspire to be and how they could benefit from respectful and gender equitable relationships in ways that motivate them to align themselves with positive forms of masculinity. It may take time to engage teenage boys in thinking critically about the harmful content promoted by online masculinity influencers, especially if they've been consuming it for a very long time. Therefore, it is important to remain patient and supportive as they talk about their experiences and work through associated issues and feelings. In our resource, we explore some of the challenges that schools, teachers, parents, and guardians may encounter when facilitating critical discussions about online masculinity influencers with teenage boys, such as defensiveness and backlash, and you can see some others mentioned there on the slide. We outline strategies for managing and mitigating these challenges. For instance, we recommend taking a positive, affirmative approach that explores how boys and men can play an active role in building a culture that supports healthy, respectful, and equitable social relationships, which is an effective way of engaging boys in critical discussions about masculinity. In our resource, we provide guidelines on how schools can take a whole school approach to building a culture that promotes respectful and gender equitable relationships, which can deter children from engaging with the harmful ideas of influencers. We identify key components of a whole school approach, which include an institutional framework that is focused on building a culture that promotes respectful and gender equitable relationships and tackling sexual and gender-based abuse. We also stress the importance of school curricula that address these issues, including those that focus on critical media and digital literacy skills that enable children and young people to understand and safely navigate digitized spaces. We also indicate that it's important to build staff capacity to do this work, which should also empower students to understand how they can build gender equitable relationships and address harmful practices. It's vital that schools make a long-term commitment to building a culture that promotes gender equitable relationships and tackles sexual and gender-based abuse and violence, which should link with the relevant national level plans, including Zero Tolerance, the third national strategy on domestic sexual and gender-based violence, and the Department of Education's anti-bullying strategy.
Finally, we end the resource with a list of appendices and signposting, including a glossary of terms, and including information about relevant training programs and resources, as well as advice and support services. I would just like to end this brief overview by thanking those who helped in the production of this resource, including our expert advisory group, Neogen Design for print design, Katrina Myrna for the cover illustration and infographics, and our funders at the Department of Justice. I will now hand over to Darragh for our panel discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Fiona, for walking us through the resource and indeed the context behind it. As you can see, complex area and lots to talk about. And we are delighted to welcome our two panelists, Dr. Kenny Doyle and Jane McGarrigle, to give us their reactions to the resource. I might start with Kenny. I can see you there on my left. Kenny, in the context of your role within Men's Development Network, you might just give your initial reaction to the resource and the needs that it's trying to address.
Yeah, like it's firstly to like to congratulate you on putting together such a great resource. I think it's something that's going to be really useful, not just for teachers, and I think it will be very useful for anyone who's working with young men and with young people in general. So social workers, youth workers, sports coaches, even. I think it's kind of beholden to all of us to be conversant in a lot of the topics that are covered in this really excellent resource. And to speak, I suppose, to the requirement for it, in 2022, we ran an attitudinal survey into masculinity, which used the concept of the man box. And this refers to a set of normative cultural ideals and beliefs which act to pressure men into behaving in particular ways. They include things such as self-sufficiency, stoicism, acting tough, limiting emotional expression, and persevering tough times without seeking help from others. And what we found back then in 2022 was that um, there was kind of far more traditional masculine views were held by younger people, more so than older people. And last week, Women's Aid released a similar research report conducted by Finney and Murphy at Core. And this used a similar methodology to ours, and it grouped participants into being either moderates or traditionalists. And again, traditionalists were those who agreed with statements such as, and I'm quoting here, men should figure out their personal problems on their own without asking for help. They should use violence to get respect if necessary. They shouldn't talk about their worries or fears, and they should never say no to sex. Also, they should be the ones to bring home money to their family. The more recent research drafted by Women's Age found that amongst the age group of people aged 18 to 29, 67% of people in that age group held these views to one extent or another. If you move to the next age group of 30 to 39-year-olds, that drops to 42%, and it keeps dropping the further up you go. So there is something being picked up here that younger men in particular are picking up on more conservative ideas around masculinity, what it means to be a man, how to behave in relationships, how to regulate emotions, and how to resolve conflicts. And something I think that has been well covered in the discussion so far is that beliefs like these, if they're truly held, can really be harmful to people. There's nothing wrong at all with being conservative. There's nothing wrong with holding traditional views. That's up to yourself. But if you believe that to be a real man, you need to hold in your emotions and you can't seek help when you need it, then what will happen when the inevitable tragedies and challenges in life, such as bereavements or illness or job loss or whatever it might be, when you're inevitably approached with those, you're not going to be well set to deal with them.
That's great, Kenny. Thank you very much. And we'll certainly come back to some of those points, particularly about the trends towards even more conservative traditional views of masculinity. Certainly well discussed by Women's Aid this week. Can I invite Jane to answer the same question? Jane, your own kind of first reaction to the resource in the context of all the great work you do in Webwise.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everybody. And to echo what Kenny said, huge congratulations to colleagues in DCU and the development of a very welcome and much needed resource. Just by way of introduction, my name is Jean and I am the National Coordinator with Webwise, and we're the Irish Internet Safety Awareness Centre. So we'll be kind of responding to this within the broader concept of digital citizenship. And what that means. And it's really great to see the emphasis on critical thinking and celebrating the opportunities and benefits of the online world, which is really important as well. We speak to lots of educators across Ireland who have been in touch and have been looking for resources and guidance for this particular topic. So it's very much welcome and, linked to relevant and up-to-date evidence, and the guidance is really useful and practical, but also addresses the challenges and sensitivities of discussing these topics with young people.
Thanks, Jane. And I suppose the first kind of theme I'd be interested in exploring with you both is kind of best practices in working with young men in an applied context. So we've provided a resource with guidelines, with kind of evidence-informed top tips, I suppose. But from both of your own work, where you're kind of front line in terms of rolling out campaigns, educational resources, working with parents, teachers, and other key stakeholders. I might ask Kenny a bit about the White Ribbon campaign, which is nicely promoted behind you there, Kenny. Could you maybe share some best practices about how stakeholders can use resources like this?
Yeah, I suppose it would be remiss of me not to point out straight away that we are actually running, I know there's a lot of teachers on this call now, and we are running a schools program where we're training teachers around areas like this, around gender-based violence, around consent, around respect, and so on. And it's a free training course for teachers. There's two parts to it. The first is an online resource of 6 modules. And then the second is a day-long training course. So we're actually taking in schools and teachers for that right now to start after Christmas. So if there's any teachers on the call who are interested in this kind of thing, just go to White Ribbon Ireland website and you'll see it from there. It's important, however, as well that kind of the onus for these conversations isn't solely put on teachers and schools. We do have a bit of a habit of kind of dumping social problems onto overworked teachers. And it's why I think, like, yesterday we launched a program in along with Ruhama and the GAA, which is about giving this kind of training to sports coaches. And I would like to see these ideas being discussed outside of classrooms, inside of classrooms, in terms of how the conversation happens. I think what the resource you're launching today captures really, really well is the difference between teaching and facilitation. If you teach someone something that's like this, it will be received as a lecture. It will be received as kind of being sanctimonious and finger wagging. And especially with young men, they'll see this as being someone who's out of touch preaching to me and they don't know what they're talking about. So the idea of facilitation, whereby you firstly you have to give a lot of time and space for this. You have to make a very safe, comfortable space for people to be allowed to express themselves. You agree a set of rules which are co-produced with the participants, and these then will be stuck on the wall and referred to if needs be. Conversations aren't shut down. They're drawn out to their logical conclusions, and I think that the resource that you've produced here captures this stuff really, really well, and will be really useful for teachers who want to take part in this.
Thanks, Kenny. And that theme of facilitation, and as distinguished from that lecturing format, is absolutely key. And absolutely a warm welcome to the many teachers who are certainly in our audience and who have gotten in touch throughout this project, screaming for resources, screaming for how do we broach this topic, because it is a sensitive one. And Jane, I might ask you a bit about the many resources and trainings and programs that Webwise engages in on many sensitive topics. Do you have any kind of best practices as regards how you manage that facilitation?
Yeah, so I think some of the key things to kind of consider when looking at addressing topics like these, complex, sensitive topics, is really important. And some things to consider around that. These are challenging topics for educators, not just influencers, but the idea and concept of algorithms and the digital media spaces we exist in. And educators may be hesitant to delve into these topics. So I think we need to look at what training we have in place for educators to effectively deliver and facilitate those discussions. And really great to hear about the training provided by Kenny. I think that would be really welcome and useful. I think it's also really helpful to think about, spending that time to prepare, and you have the information and guidance in the resource, for any SPHE teachers to do some work ahead of it on gender stereotypes, values, relationships, that work is done ahead of delving into this topic. So that there is kind of appropriate understanding and language and all developed. And that brings me to my next point, and Fiona touched on it, language. The language we use when we're doing these discussions is really important. We're not fans of the term toxic masculinity. I think it's a really unhelpful term. So helping educators look at inclusive language that doesn't alienate one group or one individual is really important. And, looking for opportunities to celebrate masculinity and explore positive masculinity. And I think, from the educators we talk to, there's a lot going on for schools. There's a lot of topics that come up and that they're keen to address, but maybe don't feel they're equipped to do so. So I don't think it's kind of helpful to look at that critical thinking piece, a more realistic approach to equip children and young people with age appropriate knowledge of the media environment, mis and disinformation, how it's spread, how it can be used against us. And to foster a critical mindset among children. So really important that educators can provide a space where children and young people can discuss and explore the complex media landscape we all find ourselves in now. And actually, this is a topic we're looking at for Safer Internet Day, which will take place in February, the 11th of February. Our theme this year is exploring algorithms and influencers. So we'll have some additional helpful talking points and activities for schools that will be published shortly as well.
Thanks, Jane. And I might even pick up on one of those themes there that relates to influencers more broadly, that there was a recent report that 40% of young people get their news about the world around them from influencers. I know it's something you've both encountered in applied settings, but it does give us a completely different context to think about how young people are seeing and interpreting the world around them. And you spoke very nicely there about some of the empowerment of their digital literacy to help them navigate the world, as opposed to that more lecturing and finger wagging approach from people like me in a facilitation setting. We have to get absolutely away from that. I was just wondering, Kenny, can you speak to any of those themes in your own facilitation work, where you're working with a generation that get their information from completely different sources, and the speed at which this has changed the cultural kind of landscape, and as per Women's Aid report, the impact it's having on attitudes potentially?
Yeah, I mean, the thing you've captured really well there is how quickly this has all changed, and how in a matter of days someone can appear completely out of nowhere and suddenly be on every social media feed. And I think the kind of I suppose political economy of the way in which these people work is worth remarking upon, because a lot of them will kind of present themselves as being a guy talking into his phone, walking down the street or hanging around the gym or whatever it might be. But these are very sophisticated marketing machines. They usually specifically hire marketers to target young men, and they look to target specific types of young men, usually those who were, I suppose, alienated, for want of a better term. And they get them in many ways to identify publicly and socially with the content that they're producing. So some influencers, for example, will give access to further content to young men who will post other content of theirs on their own web feeds, so that they might plaster their Facebook pages or their TikTok pages or whatever with content from particular influencers. And what happens then is, obviously the young person has this kind of public social identification with this other influencer and the material that they're promoting. And this can often start to only alienate them even further. And it's a kind of mire that some young men get dragged into. And then The more they identify with this publicly, the more alienated they become, and I suppose they become even riper pickings for these people who are exploiting them. And there's no other word for it but exploitation.
Thanks, Kenny. And indeed, in some of the research we
Right.
presented, that boomerang effect has been noted across many different types of work in this area. The exact thing that we're trying to do, we end up doing the opposite. And I think some of those points that you covered there speak to perhaps why that happens and how we can avoid it. And I'm wondering, Jane, when you're thinking about, you very importantly mentioned the role of language. And the importance of the likes of digital literacy and resources to empower young people. But could you speak to maybe the role of parents? Because I know that's certainly a group that can get torn between whether they address this issue head on or not. Could you offer any insights on that? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Also to echo what Kenny said, often schools are who we turn to when these issues come up, but equally parents have a really important role to play, and the whole values and attitudes piece comes from home. It starts from home. So thinking about modeling and leading by example, and what your family values and attitudes are. Also really important to recognize our media consumption, our media habits have all changed. Before, we all might have sat down together watching the same TV show or watching films together, where we could naturally unpack some of these kind of themes and topics. But we're all kind of now in our own individual algorithms, in our own devices. We're watching very different things. So it's important to make room and make opportunities to have discussions with our children and young people, having conversations at the dinner table, watching films together, taking the time to do activities together. And the experts say that the best thing we can do to support our children is to have regular discussions and conversations with them. And guardians can talk to their children from a young age about influencers, about creators, about social media platforms, and some kind of important talking points, an awareness of influencer culture, recognizing the benefits. It's a great way to kind of find out about new things, to explore different identities, to explore different cultures. Influencers can have a really positive influence on young people to raise awareness about important issues, to challenge stereotypes, to give useful advice and be inspiring as well. So it's important that we don't just focus on the negative. So we recognize that, but that we also recognize many influencers employ strategies to pull us in as well. They take you into their world, make you feel like you know them. One of our youth panelists told us that the influencers they follow feel like their big sister. But to recognize that they are doing a job, that this is an economy, and a lot of the time that they're selling products. So talking about recognizing advertising, they are required to label their posts if they are ads. So, the hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored post. So to get young people thinking about that and understanding the influencer economy, and I suppose developing those critical thinking, it's really important to critically assess messages that we see, read, or hear online. And I suppose also to highlight there's lots of great resources out there for parents. If you're new to this, you want to find out more, great starting points are the Webwise Parents Hub, the ISPCC Digital Ready Hub, and the National Parents Council, who have a brilliant helpline and offer training as well. So there is lots of helpful resources for parents and guardians.
Jane. And absolutely, the influencer economy, there's a real paradox there, isn't there? The very dynamics that are perpetuating this problem can also potentially help address it too. I'm conscious of time. I might try and weave in some of the many questions that we have here. The first of which is to think about some of the reasons why we would name certain influencers, for example, Andrew Tate in particular, and the risk perhaps of giving credence to that person. From my own perspective, and certainly the resource, we did discuss this at length and in tandem with our research advisory group, and a lot of the points that even Kenny was making there about facilitation, we have to meet young people where they are. And the second that a young person realizes that you don't know who a certain influencer is, you're missing a point of engagement. But there's a fine line between discussing, mentioning, and inadvertently endorsing. So that was something that we thought about at length. But Jane or Kenny, do you have any perspectives on that question? How much we should name certain problematic people or avoid at all costs? How do you approach that? Feel free to jump in, whoever.
I might, jump in there. So, this is something we would think about a lot as well, and generally, in our advice and guidance to teachers, particularly for younger children or younger teens, we would encourage them not to maybe name specific platforms or name specific individuals to talk in more broad or general terms. I'm not sure if anybody here remembers the Momo challenge from a few years back, but that was a viral hoax challenge that spread not across Ireland but across Europe. And again, the approach was to avoid naming it, where maybe younger users might go seek out this content. And I know from the research in the resource, young people aren't going looking for this content. A lot of them are finding it from their For You pages, so it's being served up to them. So I think that's important to remember as well.
Thanks, Jane.
Yeah, I mean, by not naming someone, you're also giving them as much power. Like if it's kind of like I can't remember the name of the villain in Harry Potter, but he who shall not be named. Children will know who you're talking about, and young men will know who you're talking about. I would take on board the point completely, though, that you don't want to give credence to some of these people who say these awful things. But you can just assume that every young man in Ireland knows exactly who we're talking about, and they know exactly, and they have been in contact with this material. It's not a case that they will hear about it from us for the first time, or they'll read about it, or they'll hear it from teachers for the first time. Anyone who has a smartphone has been in contact with this material.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Just looking through a few questions, if I can combine two, which is about kind of the use or indeed the adaptation of the resource, whether it's for girls, whether it's for third level, or even the specifics of kind of lesson plans. From both your perspectives, how could or should this resource be used in across various contexts? Would you have any initial reactions to some of those questions?
Do you want to go ahead, Jane, or will I hop in here?
Go ahead, Kenny.
Well, there is starting to be a kind of critical mass against this kind of material in general. What this resource does very well is kind of marshals a lot of them together, and it's based on very, very up-to-date research, and it's also within an Irish context. There is other resources like this that have been set up in other countries. There are other organizations around the world who are trying to address these same questions, because this is by no means an Irish phenomenon only. So for any other English-speaking country in the world, if you do a Google search, you'll find resources similar to these. So in terms of how this could be used, I suppose that the first place to do, if you're a teacher, is to look at facilitation, look at making the space, and space also includes time. If you're having a discussion like this and a bell rings and everybody gets up and runs away, that could happen at the most inopportune moment possible. So there really needs to be the time taken to allow young people to have their voice in this, to explain it. Um, there has to be the creation of a space which is safe, where they won't be ridiculed or mocked, where they feel confident enough about expressing things. And again, what we come back to is that difference between teaching and facilitation, that this is about co-producing with the young people who are with you, about co-producing ideas around what it is to be a man, what it is to treat people with respect, how you would like to be treated, how you would like your family and friends to be treated. And like that's not an easy thing to do. And these are very, very difficult conversations to have. And in particular, I would think when I was 16 or 17, and if people tried to have these kind of conversations with me, I'm sure my reaction would be to try and get a rise out of the poor teacher trying to teach me something. And it's to be aware of things like that too, and to know how to react to that. And teachers are highly skilled, highly educated professionals who are at the coalface who know how to do these things. So it's about giving them the time and the space, and in particular the trust to carry out these discussions.
Absolutely. And any other thoughts on that, Jane? I just see a comment here as well about the context that we're living in, where, smartphone bans is now a political hot potato, and this whole thing of how do we actually do meaningful work with young people in those contexts?
Yeah, so I suppose we're seeing lots of discussions around the world at the minute about how we should protect children online, and lots of discussions about social media bans at the minute. I suppose it's really important that we are teaching and supporting children and young people to be able to navigate the online world, and that they're developing those skills from a young age, and that we're not locking them out from these worlds. But really important to acknowledge that these spaces were not designed with children and young people in mind, and do not adequately respect or meet their needs. I just did a session with about 90 youngsters this morning as part of our Safer Internet Day training program. And we asked them what the one thing they would change about social media. And top of the list came toxic algorithms. This is their language, not our language. And aggressive algorithms and and disinformation, and creating a respectful online space. Those are the things that children and young people want from the online world. And, we all have a role to play in helping that. It's not just about education and, doing the work in the SPHE classroom. There's much more needed for this, safety by design, proper safety by design. And I think, this week we've seen Instagram is introducing ways to reset your algorithm. Much more of that is needed, and of course effective regulation and understanding what that regulation is. I'd like to give a shout out to Commissioner Mann's new resource on protecting your rights online, again, which helps young people understand what this new regulation means for them and how their rights are protected online. I also see, a couple of comments about resources and applying this in the classroom as well. I might give another shout out to a really good resource that our colleagues in Europe have developed. It's called Control Alt GBV. It's a visual education resource on gender-based violence online, aimed at young people aged 13 to 18. So the materials aim to address, facilitate discussions on gender and gender identity, encourage reflection, provide concrete guidelines for action. So the activities are different scenarios, quizzes, and discussions that students can do together. It's also supported by an online course for teachers. I might share it in the chat, and maybe it could be posted in the wider chat there. The course is finishing up this week, but the materials are really, really worth the look. And also the Gentopia game as well, which is brilliant. Gender Equality Matters program, again by DCU. And Locker's program from Webwise, lesson 5 in particular, media influence and gender stereotyping, might be a helpful way into this topic as well.
Thanks, Jane. And absolutely, in the resource itself, we do give a lot of signposting to similar resources, because where teachers in particular are the expert, and depending on their specific goal for certain lessons or for facilitation like this, they may wish to avail of different sorts of resources. And just looking at a few questions there, like you know, the framing around the framing here around masculinity towards conversations about a conducive context for sexual violence, particularly violence towards women and girls, or the panel's opinion on having female staff members facilitating this, the target audience, boys versus mixed. Like, there's a lot there, which my own first reaction is, of course, it depends on what the goal is of that given session. It may be more towards that digital literacy piece. Here's how influencers are influencing you. It may be more about how it could be negatively impacting your attitudes towards sex and sexuality, or it may be something that's a bit of both. But do you have any initial reactions to those points, Kenny?
Well, I know from running the White Ribbon schools program that we are finding there is it does tend to be, we've only run 2 years of it so far. The first year was a pilot, and it tended to be people who were very passionate about this particular topic, who would be most likely to come into it. And there would actually be a fairly equal gender mix of men and women who undertook the training and who took this kind of knowledge back into their own school. I think in terms of gender facilitation, it would be something, I suppose, that teachers would know within their own school context. I wouldn't want to be prescriptive to say that women should or shouldn't do particular types of training with boys, or that girls shouldn't do particular types of training. I think all young people should be trained in this kind of stuff, because, I suppose, to put it bluntly, women are more likely to feel the very negative features of what comes out of these influencers, and that's a horrible thought to have to say out loud, but it's a fact. So they should be aware of this. This training should be given to them. As regards the gender split, I suppose, of who should deliver this training. I think it would be teachers themselves who really know what would land. But what I would keep coming back to is this idea that it has to be a facilitation, it has to be a comfortable space, and it has to be one where young people can feel that they'll be listened to, that they can co-produce whatever comes out of it. And again, this is a real skill. I'm not actually a facilitator myself. I just round up people who can do this great work. But teachers would be best placed to know how to do this, I suppose.
Thank you, Kenny. With an eye on time, we're doing remarkably well. 2 minutes left. I said my own bias when we were prepping for this webinar. My own bias is towards solution-focused, progressive, positive slants on what are challenging topics. So we might close with your own brief top tip. One good thing from both your own work, one good thing that tends to work, that gives you some encouragement when working on these challenging issues. Do you have one thing that springs to mind that keeps the positive energy flowing?
for us in Webwise, it's our youth advisory panel, working with young people, involving them in the conversations, and making sure that their voices are heard and included, and that co-creation piece. As I mentioned, we were on a session with 90 youngsters today, and we can never presume that we know what they're interested in and what matters to them. So that for us is always really, really important, and also the rewarding piece of it as well.
Thank you, Jane.
I'd say that I know when we talk about the influence of some of these people and the reach that they have, that it can be very dispiriting. And when we see things like the Women's Aid research last week, that can be very dispiriting. But when you're dealing with young people, you always have to realize that they're a project of becoming. They haven't settled on who they are yet, and you can influence that by engaging with them positively. And again, the idea of an invitation to a positive discussion rather than a lecture. And because most people, when they kind of think out the outcomes of people who believe these kind of things and who profess these kind of things, most people are good, and they don't want to be part of these discussions. They don't want to be actively harming themselves and others around them. And they're the people that you need to be engaged, and they're the people that need to be brought into the conversation, and they're the people that need to take that message then out to their peers and to their friends and so on.
Thank you so much, Kenny. Before I wrap up, Jane or Kenny, was there anything that we haven't covered that maybe you'd both like to address?
No, just again to congratulate colleagues on this, and to encourage educators to take a look at the resource and the other resources that are available from Kenny, from Webwise, for parents, from the Irish Safer Internet Centre as well.
Thanks, Jane.
Yeah, and I suppose the last thing, again, I'll be killed when I go back to work later if I don't mention that we are now taking schools to participate in the White Ribbon Training Program. So if you go to the website, it's been shared in the chat, and you can sign up. It's a completely free resource, and we'd love to have you.
Thanks, Kenny. And the resource itself has been shared in the chat as well, but it is on the Anti-Bullying Centre website. And look, this is a continued conversation. We would love to hear from teachers, educators, and various stakeholders as to how the resource is or isn't working for them. This is absolutely a project that we would love to continually ideate. So just to say that. I want to give a big thanks to my colleagues, Dr. Fiona O'Rourke and Dr. Catherine Baker, who've been fantastic collaborators in advancing this, and particularly Fiona, who really spearheaded the resource as you see it there today. So huge thanks to them, and indeed to our funders from the Department of Justice. This is challenging work, and it's great to hear kind of the top tips from people applying this resource in different ways. So thank you very, very much. Thank you to Orla, our interpreter here today, and thank you all of you for giving us your lunchtime, and stay in touch.